Okay, so let's get started. Thanks for coming, everyone. So my name is Leo Zulu. I am the director for the African Studies Center here at Michigan State University. And it's a pleasure to invite you to this distinguished lecture. And I know for those that are here in the room and lots of people as well out there attending this remotely, welcome to this afternoon, to this afternoon's talk. We're really excited to welcome Professor Molefi Asante. So it's like he was here last year as well. So it's almost like we're going to put him on this circuit here, the MSc circuit. So he keeps coming back. I know our colleagues from BFSA, the Black Faculty and Staff Group, and they are looking to bring him back as well here. So Professor Molefi Asante is a professor at the Department of Africology at Temple University in Philadelphia. So he's also the president of the Molefi Asante Institute for Afrocentric Studies. And he is also Professor Extraordinarius at the University of South Africa, and also a founding editor of the Journal of Black Studies. And he was also the first director at UCLA, University of California at Los Angeles, of the Afro-American Studies unit there. So I don't know, I think he curves the definition of prolific because he has published 104 books and more than 500 articles. So where did you get the time? Do you sleep? and so really the amazing, not just publications, but he's at the forefront of African thought. In fact, he founded this concept of Afrocentric studies. The Afrocentric paradigm is all his work, and he continues to produce books on this work. And can you imagine? And then 200 PhD students that he has graduated. So, and he was just telling me in the office area about how at Howard, the African American department here has six, was it five? 5 of his PhD students are in the same department. And then I was thinking, oh, it's like they just moved the grad house from university, they moved it to Temple. so this is really an amazing impact. And so lots of honorary degrees and lots of universities in Africa, he lived and worked in Zimbabwe too, the Zimbabwe Institute of Mass Communication. And then he's done lots of work in Asia, Europe, and America. He was just in Brazil. Remember, there was a speaker here from Brazil talking about Afrocentrism, and so he's connecting with those groups as well. So it is a pleasure to invite him here. It is particularly important for us at the African Studies Center because we're celebrating 65 years of the start of the African Studies Center. And so we have some events organized, themed across the year. We end up with a conference at the end of the year. But this month of February, and Professor Asante caps our core celebration of Black History Month, as well as the 65-year anniversary of the African Studies Center. So this is an excellent center. We're looking at the shared struggles and promises and destinies of the broader African diaspora. And we couldn't find a better person to tie down our month of celebration than Professor Asante. So Professor Asante.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. MSU again. I have, come to think of Michigan State University as one of my homes. So it's always good to be here. You guys are remarkable, and your longevity as an African Studies Center is also really wonderful and remarkable. And I'm just very, very happy to be able to come again and to speak to you, and to speak also with those who are on Zoom, who are out in the world somewhere. I know that they've written to me and they've spoken to me and told me that they will be watching. So I'm just really happy to take this opportunity to say a few words. Dr. Leo Zulu, of course, is a very modest man, but he has maintained here a center along with his staff and his faculty colleagues. He has maintained a center that has national and international reputation for its work, and I'm honored to be a part of this program for Black History, but also for the 65th anniversary of this program. It's a great honor, and I know you have. I start to say you haven't been here all those 65 years, 65 years, but you've been here a lot of them, most of it, and it's really great to be here. Today, I want to talk with you about something extremely important to me and to all of us, I think, and that is that for half a millennium, there has been a decided erasure of much of Africa's history, and particularly Africa's contribution to the world. I think the last time I spoke here, I was speaking on being human being, and I was talking about the origin of Homo sapiens on the continent of Africa. And I was explaining that there is only one humanity, and that humanity is the humanity that rose up out of monogenesis in the continent of Africa. There is no polygenesis. There's only one Homo sapien race, and that race originates on the continent of Africa. So the 8 billion people on the earth today are all people who are descendants of African women who lived on the continent of Africa. So that is what we know by science. So the question becomes for me, as it had always been for me as a student, as a graduate student at the University of California, I argued with much of the stuff that I was receiving because I was really concerned that there were so many gaps in human history, and so much of the knowledge was contradictory to what one would know just by common sense. And so I had many issues, and it was good because even though I was able to come out with a degree in communication, Denise, it was later that as I began to develop my interest in culture, that I developed a strong sense of, or a necessity to learn about cultural realities. And it was at that point that the race paradigm became problematic, because the race paradigm, which was constructed by Europeans for the notion of a racial ladder in which they would be at the top and everybody else be in the bottom, was in itself a construction that was made to not only erase the history of other people, but to introduce the notion of white supremacy. So it was a revealing find for me, because what it meant was that almost every discipline, whatever the discipline happens to be in the university, starts with the notion that some European started it. It starts with the notion that there is nothing in Africa or Asia or anywhere else in the world that is before that. And this to me just didn't make any sense. Not when you tell me that Homo sapiens began on the continent of Africa. And yet you don't tell me that the first people to figure out how to cross a stream of water or to build a fire, that these people were not Africans. How that somehow the engineers, the early engineers of structures, stone structures, were not Africans. Tell me how you explain that. See, there's a problem. So there are big problems in this. So this year, I am on this quest for trying to understand the African side in African presence in the foundation of science. And I wanted to start with this quest because part of what we know now is that a large part of the discussion about STEM and AI that we have, people don't even consider Africa anywhere in that. So I want to just sort of refresh our memory because I know you know all this stuff. I just want to refresh your memory. And the first thing that I want to do is if I can figure out how to move this, advance this. Thank you, Zula. I think it's, yeah, that was the one that I did. Okay, which one did you do?
Okay, we're gonna get.
Okay.
I think it'll stop.
Okay, I was stuck. All right, thank you very much. So the first thing I want to do is to introduce you to Imhotep. And I want to introduce you to Imhotep because if I were in some other discipline, the first name that you would hear in terms of human history or civilization or anything like that would be Homer. And that to me is problematic. And it should have been problematic to the people who started that because they should have known that someone coming at 800 BCE, 800 years before the Christian era, that person is much too late. They should have known that just, hey, wait a minute. Since Homo sapiens arose around 250,000 to 300,000 years ago, and when we start talking about knowledge and everything, we start with the Iliad and the Odyssey. At 800 BCE, something is wrong with that picture. But most Europeans don't have a problem with that. And most people who are trained by Europeans don't have a problem with that because they see Homer as a great giver of the civilization, of the Hellenic civilization. And that's the beginning of European civilization. That's a problem. And it's a problem for a number of reasons. Number one, almost 2,000 years before Homer, living in Africa was Imhotep. 2,700 years before the Christian era. He built the first pyramid. Think about that. The first physician that we have in history. The first architect that we have in history. The first engineer. The first poet who wrote the harvest song that we have in history is a Black man, Imhotep. Built the first pyramid, the Saqqara pyramid, the step pyramid of Egypt. Why is it that school children in Michigan or in Pennsylvania, where I live, or in Europe or Africa or Asia, don't start their education with Imhotep? You explain that. Explain that to a child, that you're going to start with Homer 2,000 years later than to start your discussion of knowledge and civilization and humanity. You start with somebody who's much later. Well, first of all, that means you have to dismiss all the knowledge that was going on before Homer. You have to dismiss Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching. You have to dismiss Confucius. You have to dismiss the Bhagavad Gita. You have to dismiss all of the writings of the ancient Nubians and the Egyptians. You got to dismiss all that to get to Homer. You can't get to Homer otherwise. There's no way to get to it. So this dismissal meant that somehow we were able in the educational process in the West to have a whole knowledge system that erased Africa, all the African origin, nothing there. The only thing, sometimes you would hear someone say, well, you know, in Africa, they had hunters and gatherers, something like that, you know, sort of an aside. But even the hunters and the gatherers, as I always say, were scientists. Because what is a hunter anyway? I mean, what is this about? And what must you know? And what do you learn hunting? You see? But that's another discussion and debate. But today, the idea is that at the beginning of science is an African, Imhotep. Never forget that. And wherever you are in the world and you're listening to this, never forget it. It is Imhotep. And if you know that Imhotep is at the beginning as the first multi-dimensional human that we know of, then we're on solid footing. We can have a conversation. So philosophy, they say, was the first science. And that question is very interesting as well. I mean, normally when you study Western disciplines, people will say that, well, history came from study of philosophy, or, you know, different fields may have broken out of philosophy and so on. But the word philosophy, and this is very important to understand, the word philosophy, of course, has a Greek origin, particularly with the word philo. Philo, we know, means either lover of or brother of. This is the city of Philadelphia, for example, the city of brotherly love. Philo that's a Greek word. But but when you start looking for etymology, the word Sophia, they will tell you in the dictionary of etymology that the word Sophia is unknown. The origin of Sophia is unknown. But I've always said it's not unknown. It's that they just didn't look in Africa. You know, the thing is that when something says unknown, always think that whoever is writing because they are unaware of any other language or any other information outside of Europe. Don't say, to say unknown, they should say it's unknown to Europeans. But don't say unknown. You know, you can't say that. So Sophia, we find the roots of Sophia in the word Seba. The word Seba is a word that first appears when you read about Antef in 2100 BCE. Antef says that the Seba is one who gets up early in the morning and goes out and thinks and walks and reflects. And this notion of Seba is the word that becomes Sophia in Greek. This is an African word, Seba. And in fact, that's one of the interesting things that people in the classics did when they start trying to classify African writing, particularly the classical writings. They said, well, these were wisdom teachings. So there's wisdom literature in ancient Africa, but there's not philosophy, but it's wisdom. And the word for wisdom becomes Sebayet. There's Sebayet. There's wisdom teaching, but not philosophy, because philosophy is reserved only for Europeans. Philosophy is rational. Wisdom teaching is, well, you just thought of something. The indigenous people of America, they didn't have philosophy. They had legends. And the Chinese may have had sayings. Confucius, the sayings of Confucius, but not philosophy. Philosophy is reserved. It is a Greek thing. Only the Greeks had philosophy. Well, that's nonsense. The idea was at the very beginning, 2100 BCE, Seba, the whole idea of this comes from the early Africans along the Nile Valley complex. That is why I wrote the book, Egyptian Philosophers. I wrote that book because, you know, these philosophers existed, some of them a couple of thousand years before the first Greek philosopher. The first Greek philosopher was Thales. He lived around 600 BCE, 200 years after Homer. 600 BCE. He's the first Greek philosopher. Nobody identified as a philosopher, as a Hellenic philosopher before Thales. Pythagoras was second. And Isocrates was the third. And these philosophers, Thales, Pythagoras, and Isocrates, lived before Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Those three, Thales, Pythagoras, Isocrates. Isocrates wrote the book Bucerus, in which he says that he studied and learned philosophy from the people in Africa. This is what he says. Thales tells Pythagoras, and this is very interesting, when Pythagoras goes to him and says, I want to learn philosophy. He says, you must do as I have done and go to Egypt and learn philosophy from the priests and the philosophers. That's important for us to know, but we don't know that. We don't study that. We don't learn that in high school or college. And we should, because if we did, we would have a better understanding of the world and a better appreciation for knowledge of humanity. So when you look at this, and we know that Antif was there, then one of the things that we discovered, that the ancient philosophers of this whole realm of Nile Valley civilizations not only included Imhotep, but they included Ptahhotep, they included Kagimni, Sahoptibimbre, they included Dwarf, Amenhotep, the son of Hapu, who it is said knew everything there was to know under the sun, Merikari, Amenemhat, Akhenaten, Amenemope, and so on. And this is in my book, The Egyptian Philosophers, that came out in 2008, 2000, I'm sorry. So I give you this, I give these philosophers, I had to read and study because I was interested in why is it when I'm in the university, they start me with, they sometimes mention Thales and Isocrates and Pythagoras, but they mainly start you with Socrates and Plato. I said, well, there had to be somebody thinking before them. Where did they get their knowledge from? Who taught them? There had to be philosophers before them, and there were philosophers before them in Africa as well as in Asia. But it's an erasure of history. And it's an erasure of history for one purpose, I believe. It is the attempt to shut down all avenues of light for everybody so that you have one light, and it is white supremacy. That's the way I believe it. I may be wrong. Somebody can prove me wrong, but I think that this is the way I see it in terms of looking at how they have structured this thing. What did they teach, these philosophers, these African philosophers? What they taught? They taught philosophy. They taught astronomy. They taught astronomy. This is interesting. They taught mathematics, geometry, medicine, architecture, anatomy and physiology, acoustics and music. These were just That's not all they taught. And also they had an ethical base to that, which was called ma'at. But this is what they taught. So if you want to know astronomy in the ancient world, you had to go to Africa to learn, because how did they master this? They mastered it because in the Nile Valley, and both Kush and in Kemet. Kemet is the African name for Egypt. Egypt, remember, is a Greek name. Greeks call it Egyptos, but the Africans called it Kemet, right? So Kemet and Kush, those two civilizations, it hardly rained. The only water they had most of the time was the Nile River. That's the only fresh water. It could go for 10 years without rain. That's how they began astronomy. They would be on top of their houses looking up at the sky, and they would measure and plot the stars. They did this. This is how this was the beginning of everything about astronomy. And then what human beings did in Africa, they tried often to replicate on Earth what they saw in the sky. This is why we get some of these stellars. I'll show you some of these things in a minute. But they also learned geometry. Why did they have geometry? They had geometry because every year when the Nile overflowed its banks, it destroyed all the farms. It destroyed your territory and my territory. In order for us to recuperate, once the floods had gone, we had to decide, how much land did you have? How much land did the other person have? And how did they do that? By rope stretching. They stretched the ropes before the floods came. They measured the earth. That's the geometry. They measured the earth, measured the amount of land you had. When the floods were finished, they could give you the same amount of land. That's the beginning of geometry. It begins right in Africa. It doesn't begin anywhere else. It's the origin of it. Medicine. The first example of the diagnosis of diseases come in the same civilization, the Nile Valley civilization. It gives us this incredible amount of diagnosis of diseases, early diseases. And one of the first, as it says, one of the first physicians was Imhotep himself. He was a physician, you see. All of this is written. Everybody, people who want to know can know this. This is not some secret science or knowledge that Molefi Asante knows. This is stuff that I read in the libraries, just like you can read it in the libraries, right? And I study it just like you can study it. It all exists. The earliest books on medicine are African books. The earliest books that tell us about math are these African books. The Moscow Papyrus, for example. The Moscow Papyrus is very, very early. This is the very beginning of mathematics. The Rhine Papyrus. This Rhine Papyrus is a book of problems and solutions. And of course, as I said, the medicine papyrus, Ebers, the Ebers Papyrus. These are all medical, technical books, you see. And the reason that they knew anatomy and physiology was because of mummification. They were the people who practiced mummification, and it was essential that you study the human body. And they studied the human body, and they knew the organs and the function of the organs. And they were able to describe this. This is because of the mummification process. It's essential, and so forth. One could go on with this, but it would be too long. But I just wanted to point out, I've already mentioned to you that the people who they taught, were, and they taught later, and this was the Greeks. 600 BCE, Thales goes to Africa, and he studies. And then after him, Pythagoras. And then later on, much later than Pythagoras, Plato goes to Africa to study. Anaxagoras, Anaximander, Democritus, Solon, the giver of laws of Athens, they all studied in Africa. That's where they learned. And then they went back to Greece, but that's where they learned. But at some point in history, as you know, the Greeks actually took over Egypt. This was under Alexander, 333 BC. You have Alexander the Macedonian conquering Egypt and takes over. When he takes over, he's taken over all of the legacy and heritage of the ancient people of Africa. He's taken over. He's in charge. He's sort of a colonial master. He's in charge of the colony. I've taken over this colony, and this colony now will be run according to his demands. Now, I have developed a tool here, and I'm going to explain it to you because I'm going to use it in a few minutes. It is called plausible identity credibility. Plausible identity credibility. It's when someone in history for whom there is no photo, you don't know, you've never seen the photograph of the person, can reasonably be claimed to belong to one population rather than another. And you can establish that idea on the basis of parallel examples across historical records. That is called plausible identity credibility. That's the tool that I developed for this analysis. And I developed it for this analysis for this reason, because I also ran into another problem. If you read about people in ancient Egypt who were in science, many times the people who write about them will even draw pictures of them as white people. Or they will sometimes say that these were Greeks. This happens almost 90% of the time, maybe 95% of the time. You will see that. If you raise a question about some individual in ancient Egypt who lived during the period of Greek occupation of Egypt, if it is a scientist, they will say Greek, or they will show you a picture of a Greek person, all right? So, for example, here's my criteria. I'm going to try to illustrate with you. George Washington Carver. His parentage unknown, birth says parentage is unknown, and this is hypothetical because his parents are not unknown. Birthplace unknown, that's not unknown. Location of his work, Alabama. Students and traditions and rituals, ancestral shrine. George Washington Carver. If you heard that name and you didn't know that he was a Black person, you would say he was a white person. You might even say, if you, for example, heard the name Benjamin Banneker, Benjamin Banneker, you wouldn't know. If you didn't know, you wouldn't know. You see what I'm saying? So people, or let me just take a more personal example. When I first went to Africa I'm born in Georgia. I grew up, I had a name called Arthur Smith. So I go to Ghana, right? In 1972, I go to Ghana at the University of Ghana at Legon. I asked them, do you have a copy of my book, The Rhetoric of Black Revolution? They said, yes, we have that book. And we brought the book out. And the librarian said, Oh, when this book came in, I thought it was an Englishman. My name was Arthur Smith. That was reasonable for him. You know, what else? You're looking at a black man, and the black man has a English name. What can he say? You know, he said, I just thought, we didn't know. He was Arthur Smith. He said, you're telling me you're Arthur Smith? I said, yeah, I'm Arthur Smith. That's when I decided to change my name. And that's right. That changed my name in 1972. But here's the thing. The incredible thing that happens to Africa and with African scientists is this, that if you look for Diophantus, one of the things that shows up is this picture of Diophantus, all right? But shows up this picture of Diophantus. It's sort of, it gives you, you don't quite know whether he's black or they tried to do an interesting thing, but if you Google Diophantus, that's what will come up, that picture, and it's like, wait a minute, what are they trying to do here? They're trying to take an African and try to figure out, make you say, well, we don't even know who. But this was a black man, but they don't know. And why do I know it's a black man? Because I use plausible identity, criteria, and credibility. And that tells me, first of all, he only lived and died in Africa. He didn't go anywhere else, as far as I know. And not only that, but he was doing his work out of a tradition that was African. And I got a number of people like that. Eratosthenes, Heron, Hypatia, Euclid, Menelaus, Pappus, Claudius, Ptolemy, Plotinus. All these people, I believe, are African people. But if you read the literature, it would say Greek this, Greek that, Greek this. Why? And all these people were born in Africa. Not only are they born in Africa, they're living in Africa. It doesn't mean that they couldn't have been of Greek heritage. I'm not saying, I'm telling you, but plausibly, I'm telling you on the basis of the knowledge that they had and that they were able to accumulate, we don't find this same collection of people in Athens. In other words, you can't say, where do we find these people? We are all these people in Africa. We don't find them in Greece. We don't have a collection like that of scientists in Greece. We don't have that. There's no. We had spots here and there over long periods of time, but we never had this collection. All these people are people who are living in Africa. Let's take a couple of them, for example. Let's take Hypatia. What's the depiction of Hypatia? You can see her there at the bottom center. A white lady being dragged by black men. That according to the Europeans, is Hypatia. Now, first of all, if she's in Africa, she didn't go anywhere out of Africa. Never went out of Africa. And only lived to be 45 or 50 years old. Never out of Africa, but she was a great mathematician. They got the black people basically persecuting her. Think about that. Now, Hypatia was a black woman. Plausible identity, credibility. Who killed her? The Christians killed her. She's not killed by anybody but the Christians who had, those were Greeks who had accepted Christianity, the Copts, the Coptics. They killed her, not the African people. So the question then is, and why would they not kill her? Because the African people were identified just like she was, a pagan. The Christian says she's a pagan because she knows mathematics. So that's why they killed her. Read about Hypatia. But over the years, Hypatia, because she was the first female mathematician that we have a record of, they make her white. And she was black. This is one of the examples of the erasure of African mathematics and African females particularly. And this depiction, and when I saw this depiction, this is the first time I saw it, was a couple of days ago. I said, who would draw a depiction like that? But you can only do that because you're coming out of a Eurocentric mindset. And you think that, well, this woman was killed because she was a mathematician and she was called a pagan. So it must have been black people who killed her because she was in Africa. No, she was a black woman and she was killed by the Christians. Then Euclid, the so-called father of geometry. This is the drawing that you find of him. But he was born and lived in Africa. And not only was he born and lived in Africa, Euclid, but one of my close friends and scholars has written a book about this. And let me see, he's written a book about Euclid, and he said I think I'll have a slide about it. He's interested. C.K. Raju is an Indian scientist, mathematician, and historian of philosophy, has written about this. And he says, Euclid was black. But everywhere you see, the Europeans put down Euclid as white. They draw his picture as white. And he's, again, born in Africa, lived in Africa. Of course, during a period that they say may have had, the Greeks in charge politically and so forth. So then let's look. Why did science concentrate in Alexandria, which was a city in Egypt, and not in Athens, but in Alexandria? Why that? Why would it? It's almost like in England, when England was in charge of Nigeria as a colony, right? And you would have all the intellectual power in Nigeria and not in London. Nobody would ever think that that would be the case. Why is Alexandria more important intellectually than Athens? It was more important because the root of science was in the Nile Valley. Human science, the roots of it, the universities at Waset, the university that was at Menefer, the university that was at Aunu, and the study complex at Abydos. All these were places of knowledge that were already in existence thousands of years before there was any Greece. That's where the base of knowledge was. That's one of the reasons the Greeks wanted to come there. But the Greek language replaced Sikkim in science. Sikkim is the language of Egypt, the language of Kemet. That language was replaced by Greek as an official language. And so that's one of the problems. The city of Alexandria was not a new city. It was named after Alexander, but the city that it was built on was called Rakastus. Rakastus was a fishing village that when the Greeks defeated Egypt, they took over Rakastus, renamed it Alexandria, and of course, it became their capital, and lots of people started coming. That's the political power that they had under that situation. People migrated there from Africa's interior after the destruction of Menefer and the marginalization of Waset. Menefer is the city that the Greeks called Memphis. That's where we get Memphis, Tennessee from. It's from the African word Menefer. Menefer was the great city in the northern part of or in the northern part of Egypt, which is actually Lower Egypt. Lower is northern, and Upper Egypt is south. That is geography. Okay. There was no Cairo at this time. This is important information. When Africa was the center of mathematics, we also had the development of the calendar. And the calendar that we use today is basically the African calendar. You know that, right? Of course, we know that. We study that. They told us that. But the calendar that we have is from Africa. How do we get that calendar? I will just tell you just in a simpler term because I'm trying to get through all this. All right, let me just tell you simply. Every year, the Nile River overflowed its banks. And whenever the Nile River would overflow its banks, what the scientists decided was that at the same time that the Nile overflowed its banks, they noticed on the horizon that there was a star. And that star would not appear on that horizon in that place again until the Nile overflowed its banks again. And then they counted 360 days. And they said, what? The Nile's overflowing. There's Sopdet. That's what it was called, Sopdet. We call it Sirius. That's a star series. 360 days later, we say, oh, Nile is overflowed. There's Sopdet. This began the beginning of the first year. However, it didn't always sink. Sometimes the flood would come and you don't see the star. So you got to wait. You can't start the first of the year. Or you see the star and the flood hadn't come. You got to wait. Normally, you didn't have to wait long. So you maybe 5 days. 5 days. So what they call those days, those little giveaway days, they call them holy days. They were holidays. They were days of sacrifice, rituals, dancing, music, drumming. That's how you, and so the calendar, that's basically the calendar that we use. But this was the age of the pyramid, the center of the pyramids. And the pyramids, I don't have to say much about pyramids. I'm going to go quickly on that. But this is a book by friend C.K. Raju, the Indian scholar who wrote Euclid and Jesus. And he says Euclid was probably a black woman. That's the picture of his book. Go get this book. Read this book. Euclid and Jesus. So you start, but what Europe did was give us a picture of an old white man with a beard and said, that's Euclid. We don't know. They don't know. Nobody took a picture of it. Nobody drew. But this is what they did. But that's why we have to have plausible identity credibility in order to understand that, you see. But this is a picture that CK has on his book. And so let's go quickly here. Cheikh Anta Diop. We call him the Pharaoh of knowledge. This man, this is when he was on his way to school from Senegal and going to the Sorbonne in Paris. When I speak about him, I get very emotional. He was the most significant African intellectual of the 20th century. And of course, he was attacked left and right. But it's because people sometimes, he created a revolution. You know what his revolution was? It was a very simple revolution. In 1974, there was a conference that UNESCO held in Cairo, which was called the Peopling of Egypt. Because there was this whole debate that had grown up after the deciphering of the language of Kemet. There was a big debate about Egypt. because it was the most majestic civilization in antiquity. It was the most monumental civilization on the earth. So the question was, did Black people do that? This was a big question in Europe. This is why in Chicago, and I had this discussion in Chicago at the museum. They have for a long time, they had a section, the Oriental section. Oriental. They didn't put Egypt under Africa. It was under the Orient. They didn't know what to do. I mean, they couldn't figure out, can we give Egypt to Africa? And all you have to do is look at a map. A map will tell you Egypt is in only one continent. It's in Africa, right? But the question for them was, this cannot be. We have enslaved the Africans. We have defeated them. We have colonized them. How could they have created this majestic, monumental civilization? This was a big problem. And it's when this young man, Cheikh Anta Diop, along with one other African, Théophile Obenga from the Congo, went to Paris in 1974, and they were there with 70 other scholars of Egypt and Egyptology. And they shattered them, proving that the ancient Egyptians, whether you take their culture, whether you take melanin studies, whether you take linguistic studies, the ancient Egyptians were Africans. That was the defining moment for the whole question of Egyptology. Then people start saying, well, you know, I can't be an Egyptologist because they're racist. We have to be chematologists. So the Black people start changing. Well, I'm not an Egyptologist. I'm a chematologist. I mean, I know when I hear Egyptology, I have to get a little nervous because I know that they have a false notion of African history and of African culture. And so Diop wrote several books, but his profound book, The African Origin of Civilization, is one you should get. The African Origin of Civilization. And he wrote that book around in the 1960s, and it was published in English in 1970s or something. So please read Cheikh Anta Diop. This is me standing with my good friend and colleague from South Africa. His name is Dr. Simpiwe Asante. And we went to the 100,000-year-old Inzalo Ilanga, and we were actually standing there among these stelae because this is considered the oldest site erected by humans on the earth. 100,000 years, that's long. That's long. That's, I mean, you know, when you're talking any of these other stelae, they don't go that far. Stonehenge is nowhere near that old. The pyramids are not that old. They don't go back beyond 2,800 BC. But this 100,000 years ago in South Africa, in Mpumalanga, the Africans set up thousands of structures that I believe reflected what they saw in the firmament. This was, so look at the cosmos and try to recreate on Earth what you saw. This is very important. I had to go there. This was a special trip we made. We said, we have to see this for ourselves. The reason Africans had forgotten about it, let me tell you this. This is just an aside. The reason Africans had forgot about it is because what the South African apartheid government did in 1949, when they took over African land, and they took over this area and made it a private farm. So Africans, after I went to the University of South Africa and I asked faculty members, did you know about this? And they had never seen it, never heard about it. Because if you were born after 1948 or 49, it was no longer in the memory of even the Africans because they had been moved to townships and away from that territory. When I went and brought them back, like Simpiwe, It's like, wow, we didn't know this was here because the white farmers had it. They don't tell you. They had the gold mines too. They'll tell you. And Trump says that they are persecuted. That shows you how little geography or politics our president knows. All right, so this is Nabta Playa 7,000. This is an old one too. This is in a corner of Egypt. It's actually about 100 miles away from Abu Simbel. This is called Nabta Playa. This is again Stella being thrown up. This one is in Kenya. This is the Lothagam North Pillar, Lake Turkana. These are the pyramids. This is perhaps the greatest human effort ever done. This is in Nigeria. You may have not heard of this. Again, Erido trenchification by Bilikizi Songbo. This was in Ijebu. It is a trench. This during the period that Europe was building fortresses around territory, the Africans in West Africa were building trenches around their kingdoms. This is the largest human works project in history, larger even than the Great Wall of China. The human power, man hours. This is what read up on it. They did this hundreds of miles around the territory. Instead of a fortification, a trenchification. Very, very powerful. And this, of course, is Zimbabwe. This is the walls of Zimbabwe. I won't go long. Incredible. These walls were built without cement. Stones placed together in perfect order. All right. Benjamin, I'm going now to Black history a little bit here in America. African-American history. Mathematician, astronomer, the clockmaker, the person who laid out Washington, D.C. when it was necessary. Benjamin Banneker. He was also from Senegal, 1731 to 1806. One of the first clockmakers in this country. George Alcorn, who calculated the trajectory of many rockets in space, one of the great scientists of NASA. And NASA, of course, as you know, was run for about 20 years by an African-American director. Sharon Haney, chemist for DuPont. James West, whom I was able to meet. We gave him an honorary doctorate at Temple. He was the one who, you have your phones, all your phones have the Electret microphone in it. That's what he invented. This is an African-American, lives in New Jersey, James E. West, okay? And then, of course, Calcia Johnson and Nikiah Jackson. We haven't given them enough praise. These are the two young high school students who solved the Pythagorean theorem using trigonometry. This was almost like someone discovering a new species of animal or something. I mean, the way what they did was so out of the ordinary. It was, instead of going along with the ordinary processes that had been established for solving this problem, they went on a lateral, they went somewhere else and solved it in another way. It showed that it could be solved another way. That's how brilliant these two young ladies are. And one of them is at Xavier, and one of them, I think, is at LSU now. But these are very, their work, when we talk about the history of mathematics, we write about the history of mathematics, they will be included in the history of mathematics because of what they did. These two young women, brilliant, probably should be given the Nobel Prize. And then Sally Nagase, 17 years old, just scored 1,600 on the SAT. And this was last month. So, okay, that's it. I'm finished. All right, thank you.